Welcome to the Main Perspective, Episode 8 of the podcast series Trust Across Race and Culture, The Pandemic Impact, the summary of Season 1, What We Learned. I'm your host, Regina Wharton. Let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Catherine Giscombe, former Vice President, Diversity and Inclusion, Catalyst Incorporated, consultant and founder of Giscombe and Associates. Deborah Turner Bailey, retired Global Diversity Officer and Human Resources Executive, Corning Incorporated, independent leadership development consultant. Well, everyone, this has been a great opportunity over the past few weeks to focus on the mission of the Women's Intercultural Exchange, WIE, building and bridging social capital among women of diverse cultures to foster cross-cultural awareness. We accomplished the mission with this podcast, and we even included the champions. Let's jump right in and talk about the themes. Deborah, what did you learn as you listened to the podcast series?
Regina, the entire series was very fascinating. I loved the diversity that was included in the episodes. Some of the demographics I was aware of, others less so. But a couple of things that stood out for me were family and this notion of duality. So around the notion of family, three things really stood out. One is that everyone talked about the need to protect the most vulnerable among us, being our children and those who are elderly in our populations, and how both the public health pandemic as well as the racial pandemic was impacting both their children, their parents, themselves. So that really stood out for me as a theme. The other thing that stood out for me was this notion of duality, that for most people, they are not just one thing. They're made up of a number of different things. I could be Black, I could be female, I could be GLBTQ. And so this notion that I somehow have to balance each of those, and often that people want me to choose which side I'm on or whether or not the interest of all of those things intersect, came across in a number of the episodes, and I found that very fascinating.
Catherine, how about you?
I think that for me, my first takeaway was just the strength in building coalitions. I was so impressed in listening to these learned speakers talk about things that I had not known before. So for example, one of the Asian women talked about the similarities between Asian communities and Black communities. So I had not known that there was actually an air unit in World War II that was made up of Japanese Americans whose parents were still in internment camps. Now, as an African American, I knew about the Tuskegee Airmen, but there's a real similarity there because the Japanese American air unit suffered more casualties than whites, similar to the Tuskegee Airmen. And so I also saw just a basis for building coalitions in terms of how other racial groups were stereotyped. So I learned in one of the recordings that there was a Chinese man who was murdered in 1982, and that person was mistaken for a Japanese man and therefore was stereotyped as part of the group who were stealing jobs from white Americans. And so other Asians realized that they needed to band together, that in spite of the differences in their nations of origin, they were perceived as the same by white Americans, and they really had to present a united front to guard against discrimination and to keep their communities as safe as they could. So for me, that was a major takeaway.
I was really impressed with the history. I know I learned a lot. I thought all the speakers did a great job of providing some background and historical context around their particular race or culture or even gender in the case of the champions. And a lot of thought-provoking information as well. What comes to mind, though, when you think about sort of where you were impacted the most? So I was trying to think about, what did I walk away with when I was really impacted about something I heard? Did anything like that come up for you all?
Mhm, mhm. I thought about the role of emotion in building trust and candor. And I thought that that was a real strength of WIE. And when I heard the various speakers just talk about how emotional these various sessions were that were facilitated by WIE, with my background in diversity and inclusion, I was immediately comparing the strength of those sessions with formal corporate diversity and inclusion strategies. I mean, often these kind of meetings with corporate teams around diversity and inclusion are not particularly emotional. And yet, as a psychologist, I also know that you've got to bring emotion into it to make some real change. So I know in one of the sessions that participants talked about letting themselves be extremely vulnerable and showing emotion. So there were stories about men actually crying in sessions. And I just was so impressed with the skill of the WIE facilitators in creating safe spaces in which emotional displays were okay. Because again, as a psychologist, I know that there has to be some emotion available if you want to make real change.
Agreed.
Catherine, I think that is really an important point, because it surfaced for me in this notion of being vulnerable, and that if you want to be intentional about your learning, if you want to be intentional about change and really going deep and going inside, to think about things that you may have buried, right? You have to access your emotions, and really be vulnerable. And your vulnerability allows that trust across differences to develop. And so that really stood out for me, is the notion of accessing those emotions, being vulnerable. And almost every episode talked about the importance of feeling heard, that your story could be told, that you were listened to without judgment, or questioning the legitimacy of what your story is. So that really stood out for me as something really powerful.
I remember after, I think it was the second episode, where I walked away with the whole notion around 3 pandemics: health, economic, and racial injustice. And it didn't start out that way. It started out as a health pandemic. And then next thing you knew, we were talking about the impact being far greater on people of color. And then we had protesting. And I thought, oh my goodness, how do we keep this all kind of straight in our minds around what's happening? And it's still happening. George Floyd, you can't take away the emotional impact around someone being murdered. Breonna Taylor, just all the names, just everything that's just come rushing out. And when you listen to the podcast series, you hear everyone mention points of pain that just were with them, even in the podcast as well, and will just continue to be with them, with all of us. And we talked about the pandemic impact as a subtitle for the episode, but we didn't at the time think about it being these 3 pandemics.
Well, I think the Latino women in their episode were really good at pointing out that when you talk about economics and essential workers, and that many of those essential workers are brown and Black people, So the thread is definitely there. We have this public health crisis, right? And then that impacts our economy. Lots of people are laid off or losing their jobs. We also understand a new meaning for what essential workers mean, right? Typically, I think about essential workers during the snowstorm and who's got to get to the hospital and et cetera. But as this pandemic has continued for almost 4 months now, the real impact on the economy has been devastating. And since that is connected to systemic racism in our country, then the racial injustice piece was a logical next extension to me of that.
And I was thinking especially about the Latinas group. I learned so much about the economic disparities that the Latino community experiences that I actually had not really thought about before. So I know one participant was just very, just gave us a lot of really good information about how often illegal immigrants are simply those who've overstayed their visa. And so within the United States economic and social system, legally, these Latinos are allowed to purchase a home and allowed to pay taxes and to contribute to the economy. And in hearing that, it just shed light on the disparities that exist within our society. And in thinking also about those essential workers, the brown and Black people who are risking their lives to do jobs that are deemed essential. I think what it said to me as someone working in diversity and inclusion is that from just employment perspective, corporate leaders really have to do a much better job at including these so-called lower level but essential workers in decision making about how their organizations are run. So it's these essential workers that have insight onto how the organizations are structured, how work is best done, and even how to do a better job at keeping these workers safe. That was a big takeaway for me from a couple of these conversations.
So
And it
a lot was evolving as we were going through the podcast series, right? And the new terms that have come out. So old terms, new terms. We're now with the Black Lives Matter movement back to Black, because Black encompasses everyone, whether you're from the Caribbean or Africa, or so now we're using Black. And then Latinx, which has been evolving over time as well, but certainly was far more prominent during this pandemic. So I was learning a lot about that as well. You were going to say, Deborah?
I was going to say that in addition to the impact from a policy perspective, one of the questions becomes, how do those individuals get a seat at the table? And often, at least in the corporate world and sometimes in the political world, it is through labor unions, it is through associations, but with the American economy becoming so much of a service economy now and a gig economy, many of those individuals don't have a voice at the table. And so I think one of the things we have to figure out, both at a corporate level, at a governmental level, at a local level, is how do we get those voices into the room, and how do we hear and understand the impact that new policies and regulations are having in those communities.
And sometimes we may not, I learned, we may not even realize we've included people because we didn't know who they were. So with multiracial and even with Native American, these sometimes can be people who look like someone else. And you may or may not even realize that you have someone in the room who is of African descent or Black descent or even Asian descent, as the case was with the speaker we had for multiracial, that person being all three.
Right.
And so how do you open up the dialogue which is what a lot of this is about, to have these conversations, these cross-cultural conversations?
I think it's very interesting. You're talking about new language that is evolving. And one of the things that I've noticed on a lot of forums or things that I've filled out lately has been, what pronoun do you want to have used to refer to you, right? And so I think asking that question in a very authentic and genuine way around, how do you define, how do you identify? Or in which ways do you identify, right? In terms of a lot of these different demographics, instead of assuming that the outward physical characteristics can tell you everything you need to know about that person's heritage and identity. It doesn't, right? So
It's an old paradigm.
It's an old paradigm. So we need to begin to think about identity in a much broader way. And two of the episodes really spoke to that, as the Native Americans were trying to be fully accredited or fully acknowledged tribe, right? And had, white anthropologists and sociologists coming in and taking physical measurements of them. And we remember that for African Americans, the percentage of Black in your blood determined whether or not you were Black or not. And so this whole idea of characterizing people rather than self-identification, I think we're shifting there, and I think that's a very good thing. I think that's very positive.
The dialogue with the champions.
Mm-hmm.
When Hugh McCall he made a comment about making money in his sleep. And I thought, wow, I've never heard that before, put quite that way. Because the whole notion of what's happening in corporate America in the midst of this pandemic, or all three of these pandemics, is a whole nother level of reality. And so, Catherine, you've done a lot of work in that space. So have you, Deborah. What stood out for you?
I think that what stood out for me was the challenges in building wealth. I think about how a lot of stress is put on, say, making sure that people get paid fairly within corporations. I really like the fact that the white man who talked about capitalism himself had been a very senior leader within a corporation. And I wish that more people were as enlightened as he was. And it made me think about what corporations really need to do to help build wealth in minority communities. So there are a lot of structural reasons why Black households have much less wealth than white households. Wealth basically is your savings, your investments, and major purchases like your house. And if you're lucky enough to come from a family that has a lot of wealth, they may actually give you your children a down payment for a house, which really helps build wealth. So one of my suggestions, I actually wrote an op-ed about this a few years ago, was that while many corporations contribute to 401k programs in terms of slowly helping employees build wealth, they actually could take a look at the assets of their employees. And for those employees who are asset poor, and even when we as African Americans have high paying jobs, our assets are really just a small percentage of the typical white household's assets. So if organizations were able to contribute to investment funds of African Americans, or anyone who was a little bit lower on the wealth scale than majority groups, that would go a long way toward pushing equality throughout the United States. It would go a long way toward solving the systemic inequity that we see in this country.
Wow, you may be onto something, because that's certainly part of a bold change kind of move. And we did hear the speakers all literally look to make some good suggestions and actions that we can focus on going forward. But before we go there, I do want to mention the millennials. I had so much fun with them. and mainly around social media. And I know I put myself out there because it appeared that I don't even really know a whole lot about social media, but the whole role that social media is playing with this pandemic, and the fact that protesting went on for weeks, largely through social media. Certainly everyone out in the streets and everything as well, but in terms of the organizing, if we could use that energy to organize around bold changes that are needed in order to eliminate structural racism, wouldn't that be incredible?
I remember, I think it was Dana who said, there was Gil Scott Heron who said the revolution will not be televised back in the 70s, 60s and 70s. And social media says the revolution will be televised.
It is being televised.
Every day and in many ways, people have access to what's going on, how to get organized in, a nanosecond, it feels like. And so using that as a platform for organizing, for voter registration, all of that, very powerful. And yes, I think the millennials are keenly aware of that. I also picked up too that they are keenly aware that there's a lot of misinformation out on social media as well, and really talking about their accountability and responsibility for checking sources, double checking sources, making sure they're responding if they're seeing inaccurate things out there. But that notion that the revolution will be televised definitely resonated with me, because I feel it, and I feel like I can be out of date like in 2 hours, right, around a topic or whatever's going on.
And the importance of taking a break, because
Yeah.
I appreciated that too. We have to take a break from social media. It just starts to really impact your mental health.
And I was really struck in listening to the Millennials podcast at just how sophisticated they were in their knowledge. I mean, they do seem to be able to go through social media and see what's true and what's not true. But one thing about social media is that people often will post these really in-depth articles as attachments. And these millennials were just so aware and so sophisticated in how they were perceiving, for example, the current protest. I remember one millennial was saying that pulling down statues was quote unquote performative rather than making true societal change. I thought that was really sophisticated. And I know another was very keen on the idea that slavery had been key to building capitalism in the United States, which very few people in corporations will admit or acknowledge. In fact, I actually did a workshop at an academic conference a few years back where a colleague and I talked about just the role of capitalism in suppressing diversity and inclusion. And we had such pushback from the conservative people in the audience. So I was just really very impressed with the skill level and the knowledge of the millennials that we had a chance to listen to.
I
So, Regina,
also
what were some of-
appreciated the reminder of poverty. The champions brought that up quite a bit. And just the reminder that if we don't take care of people who are at the lowest socioeconomic level, we haven't solved anything.
Right.
There are people out there that, as we know, the unemployment rate is at an all-time high. There are people who are really just struggling to survive. And so I appreciated that was a really good reminder around that as well.
And Hugh talked about that, with the Champions Group, about the need to invest in communities and the need to make capital, available so that people who are entrepreneurs have an equal footing, or at least an opportunity for equal footing in terms of sustainability for their family, and all of those kinds of things go back to this notion of why we have such a wealth gap in the United States and why those individual communities or individual families aren't able to build wealth because they're not having the investments. That might be more targeted toward the middle and upper income levels. And I think Nick really spoke to the poorest of the poor in communities across this country for whom even basic needs aren't being met, right? And how we can put together systems and funds that can help with that. Because we don't want to leave anyone behind, right?
We don't.
And I think that WIE is really good at being inclusive of so many different strata in society, different ages, different racial groups, different genders. And I just have been really impressed with the dialogue between, say, white women and women of color. We know from research that women of color, especially in work settings, are very fearful of revealing mistakes, and they tend to hide vulnerabilities as a self-protective mechanism. And we also know that from research that often there's discrimination against people of color because their performance is viewed as less effective than majority members' performance. And I think that part of what WIE does so well is to help create these dialogues where there is trust, and where if someone does have a particular stereotype or a particular way of thinking, it gets called out and discussed. And I think that WIE can serve as a very good model for facilitating very important dialogues within corporations and also just really within other structures in our society.
So do you think that building trust across Black and white women continues to be somewhat poor to a lot of this?
It's core, and unfortunately, it tends to, in this country at least, not be at the best level at this point. There was an article in the Lily and also reported in the Washington Post that among several women's groups, this was NOW, National Organization of Women, it was AAAU, the American Association of University Women, that in interviews with former employees, former African-American women employees, that they actually talked about what they called, quote unquote, a toxic white feminism, that they, as Black women, felt that they were being judged unduly harshly, that the leaders of the organization did not, in their plans for moving women forward, take advantage of knowing about the needs of African-American women or other communities of color. So this is saying that in our institutions in this country, we still need a lot of work toward bringing women of color and white women together. But again, when I think about the sessions that WIE has run, I'm very impressed with the facilitator's skill in engendering trust, in making it clear that, as one white woman put it, that it's going to be a very hard conversation. You're going to have to be vulnerable. That's uncomfortable. And yet it's still a safe enough place to have fruitful dialogue that will create real change. I think that's a real strength of WIE.
Catherine, I think that's very interesting because that goes back to that notion of duality, that if we're having a conversation about gender, that it is challenging sometimes for white women to understand that a Latina's experience or an African American's experience or a Native American, even though they are women, their experience is going to be different and perhaps very different. And just even being open to that possibility, I think is what challenges, and think about the organizations you mentioned now, AAUW, you know, very well-known, very respected organizations who made a lot of progress around gender, but everyone who is female doesn't feel included in that progress, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what's the bold change that you heard or you would suggest now that we need to think about?
I was listening to a presentation this morning, a panel from Cornell ILR School and Africana Center. And the final thing that they said was, if you see something, say something. And you know that that's often in the airports and it's around security, etc. But they suggested that that is the bold move that each of us individually can do, is just not let things pass, right? If you're hearing people misrepresent what the George Floyd murder really was, or what the protests are really about, or what Kaepernick's kneeling was really about, to take the moment to say something and offer a different point of view. So that's at the individual level, something that I think we can do from a bold perspective. And then at an individual and group level, I think it's about being politically aware and voting and getting others to vote and supporting others in doing that. Those are two things that stood out to me from the podcast.
And I think on a related note, one thing I was inspired by in just thinking about the political situation that exists in the United States, and given that politics is a really sensitive subject, I think that people still need to be aware that this current White House administration is just toxic to people of color, and that needs to be called out more aggressively. And as conservative as many corporate CEOs are, they do seem to be coming to the realization that they have to go against what this current White House administration is saying, even though they have been benefiting from the systemic inequity that's been generated by, for example, the latest tax reform from 2017. It's a real challenge for corporate leaders to do this, but I do see some stepping up, and I am really encouraged by that.
So that reminds me of all lives won't matter until Black lives matter. And that's certainly a misunderstood term. But to me, that makes it clear. Black lives matter when all lives matter. You have to include that in it. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. And so that ends up taking you to, from an individual level to a group to a system level. Corporations, you can look within every structure because racism exists within every single structure, our government, our communities, our organizations. And therefore, we need to speak up, as you mentioned, Deborah. I thought some good ideas came out of the podcast around call to action. Certainly register to vote. If you're not, make sure you vote in the upcoming election. That is critical. Do your research, know what's happening, and participate.
And I think Catherine also mentioned, think about where you can build coalitions and alliances with others across demographics. I think we forget how important that was during the civil rights movement, during other times of social unrest and change in our country. It was about building coalitions across different groups and different economic stratas. And I think we all need to continue to think about how to do that and how to be open to that. Mm-hmm. And that to me is sort of foundational and yet bold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that WIE is really well positioned to continue these series of dialogues and having impacts in the larger communities from which participants come.
Educate yourselves. Educate yourselves as much as possible. There is plenty of reading material. Go back, listen to the podcast. We had the privilege and honor of listening to the podcast multiple times, and it's really great information, but find your source of comfort and educate yourselves. Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you to our listeners. Thank you to all our podcast speakers for sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us. Thank you to Dr. Gibson and Deborah for being with us to close out the podcast. Your assessment and insights are invaluable as we look towards the future with hope. Thank you to Stephanie Counts, Dee Dixon, and Joan Zimmerman for setting the foundation 10 years ago to lead the way with dialogue across race and culture. Thank you to Rhonda Caldwell for believing in the future of WIE and the sponsorship provided by the Main Event and the Charlotte Area Fund. Stay tuned for more from the Maine Perspective.